Greetings and salutations, Dr. B here. Today we're going to go over the importance of a common B vitamin, the B12 vitamin. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons why B12 is so important, the things it does for us in our body. Um, we're going to talk a little bit about where we get it in our diet, where we're not getting it in our diet. We're also going to talk about some common medications that can affect the ability of our body to either absorb or utilize B12. And then finally, we're going to talk about uh, supplementation of B12 when it's needed, when it's appropriate, and what that all looks like. I wanted to create this video because B12 is a super important nutrient for our bodies. Um, and it's oftentimes there are often times where it can be low in people's their own bodies. And when that happens, it can be really problematic. And another reason that caused me to really want to create a video like this is to give some more deeper education into supplementation. Supplementation is very important in general. It's often misunderstood. It's very misleading. There's a ton of contradictory information. So I wanted to create a video, and we're actually going to go into some research, some literature, and show what the science says, what the literature and the science says, and try to come to a good agreement of how this stuff works. Okay, so real quick, let's review vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is also known as cobalamin. That's the general base term for the B12 vitamin. Very important nutrient in our body. It's responsible for about 5 major things. One is DNA synthesis. So every time we need to remake our DNA when our cells are dividing and replicating, B12 is an essential component, a cofactor for DNA synthesis. So DNA is, of course, the blueprint for our existence. So that blueprint can't be reprinted and remade without B12. The other things that B12 is responsible for is fatty acid and amino acid metabolism. So when we're burning fat for fuel, for example, and also when we're building up proteins or tearing down proteins, B12 is again an essential nutrient. B12 is also really important for the utilization of B9. Another that it goes back into its relationship to DNA synthesis, but B12 and B9 both very important for DNA synthesis. So this is especially important in pregnant women. So that's why in prenatal vitamins, B9 is usually pretty high and B12 should be high there as well. But you need B12 for B9 to work appropriately. We're not going to dive into the chemistry, the biochemistry of all that, but I just want to go over that concept and the reason behind that. So this is especially important information for women who are either trying to get pregnant, who are pregnant, or breastfeeding. Having enough of these particular nutrients in our bodies in the right ratios and also the right forms is critically important to their effectiveness. So anyway, so back to the things that B12 does. It's also very important for the formation of red blood cells. So red blood cells carry oxygen throughout our body to deliver oxygen to all of our cells for aerobic metabolism. So those cells can breathe and do whatever job that their job is in life. So B12, again, very essential for red blood cell production. Then the other thing that B12 is super important for is the nervous system, particularly the peripheral nervous system. So that's all of our nerves outside of our spinal cord. All of the nerves outside of our spinal cord are covered in this sheath that's called myelin. It's essentially a little layer of fat. It's a cell that's mostly fatty, and it provides insulation and conductivity for the nervous system. Very important. If we don't have myelin, our nerves cannot function. So peripheral neuropathies, people that have numbness, tingling in their hands, feet, is oftentimes can be related to B12 deficiencies. So those are the main things to review. DNA synthesis, essential. You need to have B12. Fatty acid and amino acid protein metabolism, need B12. Formation of red blood cells, need B12. Formation of myelin sheaths around the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, you need B12. Very important nutrient. You can see how all those things are absolutely essential to life. So it can't be understated how important vitamin B12 is. Okay, so now that we covered why we need B12 in our body, let's talk about some of the natural sources where we get B12. B12 is one of the only nutrients that we can really exclusively get from animal protein. Its highest concentrations are in the liver because the liver stores B12, but we also get B12 from muscle. So when we eat animal muscle, that's one of the primary sources where we accumulate B12. So this is an important reason why eating meat is essential to our diet because it contains the most amount of B12. And that's primarily where we get B12 naturally. So folks that do plant-based diet, vegetarian or vegan, because they're not getting B12 from animal sources, they pretty much have to supplement. There's really no other way um, to get B12, and that's been indicated in the literature as well. There are some B12 similar molecules that are produced by some bacterias and some fermented type foods, but it's not the same exact type of nutrient, and it doesn't happen to turn into B12 in our body. So again, B12 is primarily consumed through animal muscle, especially in the liver. So if you eat liver as a part of your diet, that has a very high, very high concentration of B12, but it's also in animal protein. So awesome. So that's where we get it in our in our diet. Another thing I want to talk about real quick is and I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see. There are two main medications. There are more, but there are two main ones that really affect our ability to absorb and utilize B12. Those two medications are gastric acid inhibitors, or oftenly referred to as proton pump inhibitors. They affect some of the gastric juices. And as we'll find out, there's a particular enzyme or protein inside of some of our gastric juices called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is paramount for the ability to absorb and digest B12. No intrinsic factor, no B12. In fact, there's a particular autoimmune condition that affects these particular cells in our gut called the parietal cells, and that impedes our ability to produce intrinsic factor, and those people aren't able to absorb B12, and those people end up getting what's called pernicious anemia. So back to what I said before, B12 affects red blood cell production. No B12, no red blood cells. And that's what happens in pernicious anemia. People aren't able to develop enough red blood cells, and they develop a dangerous anemia. Anyway, back to proton pump inhibitors or gastric acid inhibitors. So people take these medications when they have gastric reflux or peptic ulcer diseases. These drugs interfere with the vitamin B12 absorption from food by slowing the release of hydrochloric acid into the stomach, leading to vitamin B12 deficiency. Gastric acid inhibitors include omeprazole, which is Prilosec, uh, Iansprozole, I had a problem pronouncing that one, Prevacid, cimetidine, which is Tagamet, and ranitidine, which is Zantac. So this is one of the groups of classes of medications. These are very common. There are a lot of people that are on proton pump inhibitors, gastric acid inhibitors. So this is an important thing that sometimes doctors tell their patients, sometimes they don't, but that's why I'm making this video, because this is a really common medication and it can affect B12. And as we've already discussed, B12 is super important for a lot of really essential biological functions. The second one is metformin. So metformin is the primary medication that's used to treat prediabetes and diabetes. It helps to lower blood glucose levels, which is important in diabetes. The problem is metformin reduces our ability to absorb B12, and we likely will not be getting enough B12 into our system. Again, this is a very common medication. There's tons of people on both these medications. And most of the time, these nutrient drug interactions aren't discussed. Just so you know, this is right from the National Institutes of Health. I'm not making this up. This isn't a chiropractic website. This is the National Institutes of Health. So don't take my word for it. Take theirs. That's my goal, and it should be a lot of any clinician's goal. Is this isn't my opinion or interpretation. This is what the evidence has shown us. So it's clear that we can see these things. So what we're talking about now, again, is how these two common medications affect B12 utilization in our body. So that brings me to the next thing I wanted to mention here that's important. So there's really two steps. You often hear from nutrition folks or from supplement companies, for example, they talk about absorption. And that's really only half of the whole picture. Absorption is essentially whatever nutrient, in this case B12, in our digestive system, going from our digestive system into our bloodstream. That's what's called absorption. Now it's in your bloodstream. But we don't need B12 in our bloodstream. We need it in our tissues. We need it in our bones. We need it in our muscles. We need it in our liver. We need it in our brain. We need it in all of the tissues. So it has to get from the blood to the tissues. This term is called utilization or bioavailability. So those are two important concepts. The nutrients, in this case, B12 needs to go from the GI side to the blood side, and then from the blood side into the tissue side. Those two things are important. So, okay. So to recap, we've talked about how important vitamin B12 is, what it does in our body. We talked about how we get it naturally. We talked about some of these very common medications that can inhibit our ability to either absorb or utilize B12. If you know anyone that's on proton pump inhibitors, gastric acid inhibitors, or metformin, please share this video with them or explain this concept to them. Let them know they may need help with this. And there's ways that you can go around this to still use this medication, but get more B12 in your system. So, and also learn how to screen for it to see if you're low. So that one thing I'll talk about real quick is you can do a vitamin B12 test and to look at how much B12 is in your bloodstream. It's not a super useful test because the amount, like I just mentioned, it doesn't matter if B12 is in your blood. It matters if it's in your cells, if it's in your tissues. And that's where B12 needs to be. So you can look at that, but a lot of times people get what are called, false negatives. So essentially say, yep, you have plenty of B12 in your blood, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their body has enough B12 in their cells or tissues where it needs to be for it to perform its duties, its functions. So there's another common test called methylmalonic acid. Methylmalonic acid is a byproduct of the citric acid cycle. It's actually supposed to be turned into succinyl-CoA, another little molecule for the citric acid cycle, the Krebs cycle. And it needs B12 to do that. So when B12 is absent, then you have an accumulation, a buildup of methylmalonic acid, which is actually toxic. So doing a blood test for methylmalonic acid is more specific in telling you if someone is low in B12. If you have too much methylmalonic acid, that is a sure indicator that you have too low B12. So just another sidebar there. I have patients that go get B12 tests. See, my B12 is fine, but it was a serum level assessment of B12, and that may or may not be super useful. Okay, so last but not least, let's dive into the supplements. Supplementation, like I mentioned, is likely important. It's important if someone is a vegetarian or a vegan or a plant-based diet because they're not getting it through the foods that they're eating because they're excluding animal muscle as a part of their diet. So those people need to supplement. The other group of people that may need more B12 are people that are on these medications. So if, like I said, anyone is on these medications, they may also need to supplement B12. And then lastly, if there are people that have pernicious anemia, that issue before where their body is attacking their gut cells, inhibits their ability to produce intrinsic factor. Those people, it's essential to be on B12. So let's go into types of supplementation. So again, try not to just use my opinion here, not what I think is right, not what I've been told by supplement companies, but I try to see what the evidence says. So here we have a review. So a literature review is a few authors looking at all the available evidence that's out there and then doing a summary report, a narrative report on that available evidence. That's what this particular article is here. So this is from the Journal of Integrative Medicine from February 2017. It's the comparative bioavailability and utilization of particular forms of B12 supplements with potential to mitigate B12-related genetic polymorphisms. So this review goes over the 4 main types of cobalamin. For this, I'm going to simplify it and really talk about the 2 main forms of B12 that we find in supplements. The most common is cyanocobalamin. This one here. This is the most common one that's in most supplements. The other one that's utilized in supplements is what's called methylcobalamin. So let's go ahead and talk about this. This article also looks over adenosylcobalamin and hydroxycobalamin. These forms are natural forms inside of our body along with methylcobalamin, but they're not typically found in supplements. So that's why I'm not talking about them as much, but they're talked about a lot in this particular article. So again, the 2 main types are methylcobalamin, which is one of the 3 natural forms that are utilized and used in our body, and then also cyanocobalamin, which is a synthetic version. So it's a synthetic version, meaning it's created in a lab, essentially, utilizing bacteria to produce B12. But what they do is they add a cyanide component, that's where the word cyano comes from, to stabilize the molecule. And that's an important part about cyanocobalamin, is that little cyanide molecule helps stabilize it. What that means is it's more there's longer shelf life, and it's also more resistant to heat and breakdown. So that's really valuable for supplement companies and pharmaceutical companies. If it has a longer shelf life, that means your product can be sold for longer, a longer period before there's an expiration date. It also means that through shipping and handling and hot temperatures, it can still maintain its integrity. So in contrast, methylcobalamin is one of the main types of natural forms. So when we get B12 into our system, it brings it into the cell, and then it breaks it down to that core cobalamin molecule, and it adds a methyl group. And methylcobalamin is the main form that's inside of our cells. So this is again natural here. So and this one's synthetic. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's go into a little bit more detail and see, what this article has to say regarding both types of cobalamin. So let's look at the results. This is, of course, the abstract to reviewing the overall big picture of the article. We can dive in a little bit deeper, but for the sake of time, I want to stay here in the abstract. The studies reviewed provide evidence that all supplemental or food-derived B12 forms are reduced to a core cobalamin molecule, which converts to the intracellular active forms, like I was just mentioning, methylcobalamin, adenosylcobalamin, in a ratio not influenced by the form of B12 ingested. The methyl and adenosyl components of the supplemental cobalamin are cleaved inside the cell and are not used in the synthesis of the intracellular methyl and adenosylcobalamin, respectively. However, the overall bioavailability of each form of supplemental B12 may be influenced by factors such as gastrointestinal pathologies, age, genetics. Polymorphisms on B12-related pathways may affect the efficiency of absorption, blood transport, cellular uptake, and intracellular transformations. So to review all that, what it's saying here is, like I just mentioned, whatever form we do take in, the idea is that it goes into the cell and then it cleaves off the methyl part or the cyano part, and it then attaches the adenosyl or methyl part that it wants, the body wants. So that's good. That's good news. However, it says that the ability to get the B12 into the cell may be affected by a variety of things. I already talked about gastrointestinal pathology. So when people have gut disorders, so things like leaky gut could be a problem here. poor digestion in general. All these things could affect our ability to utilize B12. And then also age and genetics play a role as well. So further indication, these other scenarios where, as we age, we may need more B12, we need the right form of B12 to help our body have enough of it to do its job. Okay, so here's the conclusion. Supplementing with any of the natural bioidentical forms, methyl, the hydroxyl or adenosine versions of cobalamin. Again, those two are natural forms, but they're not really commercially available. There's no supplements that really carry those. They can be created and can be supplemented with, but they're not generally, it's a longer process to create them, so they're not found in supplements. But methylcobalamin is found in certain supplements. Anyway, these bioidentical natural forms are preferred instead of the cyanocobalamin, owing to their superior bioavailability and safety. For the majority of the population, all B12 forms may likely have similar bioavailabilities and physiological effects. Thus, it makes sense to employ the least expensive form of B12, such as methylcobalamin, like we talked about. Individuals with a particular single nucleotide polymorphism affecting B12 assimilation may raise their B12 status more efficiently with one or more of the particular forms of B12. However, because those types of single nucleotide polymorphisms are just so a singular nucleotide polymorphism is essentially just a different it's a different type of the same little gene, the different type of the same little allele. So that's what that is. However, because those are not currently reported in commercial tests, individuals may either do a trial and error approach by supplementing with one of the particular forms at a time, or they might use a supplement with a combination of all three naturally occurring forms that are commercially available for a better chance of achieving faster clinical results. The approach may or may not offset these genetic polymorphisms. So the synthetic form is not preferred primarily because for a few different reasons. One, it does have that small cyanide particle in there. So generally, we want to limit how much cyanide we're intaking. Obviously, this is a small, tiny little molecule, but still something that we generally don't want to add in. So a couple other reasons that it mentions here further down regarding cyanocobalamin. It talks about here that like I mentioned before, there's the absorption side getting into your bloodstream, which cyanocobalamin does get into your bloodstream well. So we can absorb it really well. But then it getting into the tissues is a different story. And that's what this article talks about. Ingestion of cyanocobalamin results in lower tissue retention of active B12 than naturally occurring forms of B12, like the methylcobalamin, which may be particularly problematic for individuals with these single nucleotide polymorphisms on the B12 metabolic pathways. Some researchers have also expressed concerns of potential cyanide accumulation in human tissues after long-term supplementation or intake from foods fortified with cyanocobalamin. Thus, cyanocobalamin form of B12 seems to be in the inferior choice, despite its lower cost. So what it appears to be is it's a really good commercial form in that it has longer shelf life and then it's more durable. So it makes more sense commercially, but it appears that it's not the optimal form for tissue retention, so getting into our tissues. And also there's the possible effect of cyanide accumulation in the long term. So with all those things together, the evidence seems to indicate that you want to find a B12 supplement that uses methylcobalamin. And that's important because cyanocobalamin is by far the more common form of B12 that you'll find in supplements. So it's really important when you look at the back of supplements, you want to make sure, look right at the back, and you find the version that is methylcobalamin right there. See that? methylcobalamin. So that's the form you want, as opposed to cyanocobalamin. So, all right, gang, to recap, what we talked about today was just the importance of B12 and what it does inside of our body, how to is essential for DNA synthesis, for fatty acid and protein metabolism, for the developing red blood cells, for the nervous system. We talked about how meat, animal protein is the best source, and especially liver, the best sources of how we get B12 in our system naturally. We talked about some of those really common medications, metformin and proton pump inhibitors, and how they can affect our ability to absorb B12. And then finally, we talked about the two main types of commercially available cobalamin B12 supplements, cyanocobalamin, the synthetic form, and methylcobalamin, the more bioidentical, the natural form. How that natural form appears to have better retention in the tissue. It tends to get utilized into the tissue better than cyanocobalamin. There's also not the possibility of cyanide accumulation over time. So that's it for today's talk. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you have any further questions. I'll try to post some of these studies, these articles here in the link so you guys can look at this evidence yourself. But hope you enjoyed this and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.